Today we are going to talk through a different topic than usual. We're going to talk through diversity, equity, and inclusion and how to bring that into your nonprofit organization. And we have an incredible expert here who I'll introduce in a moment. Quick note, again, thanks to my colleague Simone, who puts a ton of work into this all the time to make it a little bit better for you. This is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits if that professional certification is part of your work. There's a survey at the end, just make sure to fill that out. In case you get audited, we'll have all the backup records. And so we get about one email every 2 weeks at this point for someone who needs that because they're being audited by CFRE. So that's happening. Just make sure to make a quick note. Survey is about 30 seconds in total. Today's agenda. So we'll do some quick introductions. We'll talk about how your week is going. We'll talk about your views on diversity, equity, inclusion. So you can see how your views stack up to other folks in the nonprofit world, how your organization is doing compared to other nonprofits. And then we'll bring in Melanie, who I'll introduce in a second. Melanie is just wonderful and super excited for that. And then we'll just do some next steps in Q&A. So quick note, sometimes folks are furiously taking notes through the whole process. If that's gonna help you learn, great, but we'll also send the recording and the slides around later. So one, that might help you with taking notes. And two, if you find this helpful, there might be other folks in your organization who could use this but couldn't make it at this hour for some reason. So pretty cool. And then on Q&A, by the way, it's separate from the chat. There's a little Q&A function with, there are now about 600 people on the call, and so things get lost in the chat a little bit. So just make sure to enter that in the Q&A function, and we'll take notes and we'll sort of go through those at the end as well. All right. So I know many of you. My name is Patrick. I'm delighted to be the co-founder and co-CEO of FreeWill alongside my wonderful partner Jenny. We are also really excited to work alongside now 90 people. So big week for us, crossing that, and crossed 2.6 billion since we last talked in terms of giving. If you talk to folks on the FreeWill team, just give them a virtual fist bump for crossing that milestone, which is exciting. And then really just delighted today to be joined by Melanie Rivera. So we got to know Melanie because she has been a coach and a trainer for FreeWill, and the entire team just adores her. And usually there are trainings that are, well, some trainings are neither entertaining nor effective. Some are not that enjoyable but effective. Some are enjoyable but not that effective. And Melanie's trainings have been both. So a joy to be a part of, but also I can see our team and I can see myself doing things differently based on the training that she provided. So a little bit of background on Melanie. She is the CEO and founder of Breaker 28, which is a great leadership consultancy that she's building out. She also works at the Management Center until this summer. So Management Center, for many of you that don't know, sort of does best-in-class nonprofit training. She used to work at Donors Choose and did a ton of great work at Donors Choose. And then she has degrees from 3 of the top universities in DC. Degrees or certifications from American University, Go Eagles, from my alma mater, Georgetown, Go Hoyas, and from Howard, Go Bison. So just delighted to have Melanie here, and you'll hear a lot from her in a moment. The other thing we like to do sometimes is, because webinars are great for learning, but there's other avenues, is give away some of our favorite books. And this week, we're going to give away one of Melanie's favorite books called Inclusive Conversations. So we'll give this to 20 people. We sort of randomly draw this at the end. Can't give them away to everybody because we just don't have that much money, but delighted to do this as well. This book is called Inclusive Conversations. It's about great management, great strategy, great communication internally with a real focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just make a note in the survey that we'll send around at the end if you'd like a copy, and then you'll fill out your address and things like that. Okay, so Art Stein from the Red Cross says, highly recommend Inclusive Conversations. So if you don't get one in a week, it's not that much money. Maybe go think about buying it yourself. Thank you, Art. And thanks, James, for the shout out. James is also from American University as well. So we asked you how your week is going. You can take a look at this big blue line, a little bit down from our last session, but still dramatically higher than it's ever been. That blue line is happiness. You can see the yellow line, which is anxiety. Look how much it's dropped both from a year ago and from November. So very good things to know. Also things we always ask about what you're worried about. Big thing, top thing right now is around hitting goals. A little bit more on health and safety, but generally hitting our goals is one of the hardest things. And actually there's a lot of research that shows having a diverse, inclusive environment leads to professional success on top of being the right thing to do. So hopefully you'll learn a bit today, and that will help your whole organization as well. We got some really interesting data that I'm going to show you in a moment. So this is about How do you view yourself and your own organization, and how are you doing at diversity, equity, and inclusion at your nonprofit? So we asked folks, hey, are you committed? Is your organization committed to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what you can see is the average of 4.3. Only about 1.6% of folks gave it a 1, meaning not at all. But about more than half gave it a 5, and a good number gave it a 4. Then we asked, leadership in my organization shows that these things are important through their actions. You can see that number drift down a little bit. So more 4s, fewer 5s, more 3s, more 2s, again, very small number of 1. Organization is making progress. Are we actually, we set as a priority, are we actually having any impact here? And again, some shift towards the high end, but not quite as high as the fact that it's a priority. So a third say a 5, a third say a 4, and then we start drifting down into 3, 2, and 1. We asked whether folks are, of all cultures and backgrounds, are respected and valued at the organization. And again, about half rated it very highly out of 5. A quarter say a 4, and then there's some drifting. So about a quarter of the organizations are at a 3 or below. Again, you see very few in this sort of 1 territory. It's not terrible, but obviously there's a lot of room for growth at least half of these organizations. My organization publicly communicates about its diversity goals. This happens a lot less, and you start to see that average drift a bit. So 11% said 1, basically not at all. 15% said 2, 25% said 3, 28% said 4, and only 21% said 5. So the gap between prioritization and public communication is pretty significant, and that's just interesting for you to benchmark your organization against all your peers. We asked whether you regularly communicate about how diverse the employees, the leadership team are, and actually only 10% gave yourselves a 5. 26% gave yourself a 1. The other biggest peak here is 30% gave it a 3. So maybe a lot of room for growth here across the industry as well. And then there's diversity among job candidates considered for positions at my organization. 21% gave it a 5. 3s and 4s are the largest here at 24 and 27%. And then you can drift down a little bit towards 1s and 2s. And then within my organization though, so there's this really interesting dynamic, right? Let's go back for a second. So the pipeline is a little bit challenging on a lot of folks. And then look how much this shifts in terms of advancement opportunities. And so 40% say it's a 5, another 24% say it's a 4, 24% say it's a 3, and then there are very few 1s or 2s. And some of these answers, we may be missing things, right? If you come from a dominant group, it's sort of easy to think everyone has an easy leg up. And maybe that is true at your organization, or maybe it's not. So we'll talk about what to make sure we're noticing to make sure this is accurate. I believe my organization will take appropriate action in response to incident discrimination. Again, relatively high confidence here. About half said a 5 and 30% said a 4. And then there are some trailing numbers on 3, 2, and 1. And then my organization has done a good job at providing training programs that promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hear this a lot, that a lot of training actually isn't that good. So we're really lucky to come across Melanie, who is quite excellent. And so you can see the sort of medium peak, and the 3 is the highest, 30%. Only 21% give it a 5, and about 9% give it a 1. I feel like I personally belong in my organization. Again, it's really nice to see this is pretty high. So an average of 4.2, but some real room to grow at the low end, and a decent number of 3s. And it's pretty remarkable that almost 20% of folks say, I wouldn't give it higher than a 3, 1, 2, or 3 in terms of feeling like they belong. So obviously some room for growth there as well. Perspectives like mine are included in decision-making. We average a 4 here. So this is a little bit more inclusive than the previous one. And that's what you said. So I hope that gives you a very clear picture of how people are feeling about your organization, but also how that reflects across the industry and the various shifts you see. And there's some very clear room for growth across the whole sector. And one of the nice things is we can have communities and conversations like this where we can share some best practices, both from experts, but also as we begin to start learning with each other. So I will welcome Melanie. I will stop sharing my own screen and welcome her to begin hers. And we'll turn it over to Melanie, who I can't say enough nice things about, but I'm going to pause saying nice things about her so she can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Hey, y'all, I'm glad to be here with you. I'm just going to get my screen share set up. All right. Cool. So we have about 25 minutes to talk about leading with heart. And heart is a model that I created at Breaker 28 to help leaders that were mostly well-intentioned, or at least thought they were, right, in terms of having better impact across lines of racial difference and gender difference and power difference and other meaningful dimensions of identity difference, but we're still goofing it up and causing real harm. And so we're going to talk about this framework. I understand that not everybody here are people managers. And I also understand that fundraising folks in organizations that are dependent on money often have power we don't know that we have. I've sat on fundraising teams in the nonprofit sector, and the roles themselves sometimes give you more access than other roles, perhaps operational roles in your own organization. And so I want to invite you, even if you don't consider yourself an organizational leader or a people manager, in your organization, and many of you in the next 4 or 5 years may move into some of those roles where you'll have more access. And in that case, I want to invite you to think about these 5 letters as you approach leadership. So my purpose in the next 25 minutes is to give you a framework, and here's the framework. So leaders should be leading with heart in the nonprofit sector. We need to lead in a way that's healthy, which means sustainable. Our systems are working, our people are not working themselves into the ground. We're able to build for the long term and achieve our mission, but in a way that is as equitable in the house as it is out in the streets where we're supposedly doing our work. They need to be equitable. They need to be attending to issues of power and racial difference and gender difference and differences in sexual orientation and identity in other areas, and making sure that those that are on the margins are having the same experience, or at least a level playing field as compared to those that are more in the mainstream. And we'll talk about what that means. They need to be anti-racist, which is a term that is not new to people who've been doing this work, but really has been championed and defined by Kendi and others to help us understand that we've got to disrupt the pickle juice on the inside of us that is making us prefer and sort of center a white normative, old school Peter Drucker kind of business practice that puts people on the margins racially or by gender or other dimensions of difference in a position where they're less likely to succeed. That's the anti-racist part, and we'll talk about that. Realness means psychological safety. We need to manage in a way that builds psychological safety so that people, especially people with traditionally subordinated identities, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQIA, folks who are showing up with disabilities or with other dimensions of difference. We want to create the conditions for them to be able to show up and contribute at their best, and to innovate and to take risks in their role. And then and to give real feedback when we goof it up. And lastly, leaders need to lead in a trust-centered way. That isn't just expecting trust. All sorts of leaders want trust. But what I mean here is we've got to build capability and muscles in building and keeping and recovering trust. And that's a different set of skills than many of us have been taught. And that's especially true if they're managing a team that is racially diverse, gender diverse, age diverse, tenure diverse. We need to build trust, and that's harder to do the more degrees of separation or difference are between us. So that's the framework. And now I'm going to get much more specific about how in the world we do this, as much as is possible in 25 minutes, let's be clear. All right, so let's start with healthy. Leaders need to lead in a way that's healthy. Well, what does that mean? Well, development friends, we know that sometimes the pace of our work is not healthy. And if we're in positions of leadership, we need to prioritize sustainability for ourselves and for our team, because we can't win long-term if people are working themselves into the ground. And if we're being honest, in development organizations in the nonprofit sector, the higher you go, the less likely that there's Black and Indigenous and people of color at the top. The lower you go, the more likely that your staff that are working 50-hour weeks, 60-hour weeks, managing all these funders, reporting matrix style to multiple people, that they are BIPOC staff, or that they're staff with less tenure and power. And so sustainability here is a really important move for you as a leader, because when you aren't prioritizing the sustainability of your team, more likely that BIPOC staff, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, more junior staff, and others at the margins, so those would be folks with less power in their position and their identity and their access, they're more likely to suffer than others on the team with more privilege in their identities or more positional power. All right, so that is the general idea around leading in a way that's healthy. So what is your move then? Well, if you're a team member, if you're like, Mel, I don't manage a team, I hear you. But one option you have is you can raise feedback when you see systems or processes or workload distribution practices that are inequitable or causing harm. This is especially true for those of you on the line that don't manage people, but you have a lot of credibility in your organization because of your role. You've achieved some great success. You have the ear of your leaders. You're a rainmaker and you're winning them deals. Well, you have influence, and your ability to raise feedback around patterns that are causing harm is really important. If you're a manager, though, whether you're managing a few development associates or in your another operational role or whatever, and you're managing some staff, well, then the moves are a little different. You should be asking about workload and helping team members prioritize. I've seen people do a lot of the first and very little of the latter. So just, how are you doing? I'm overloaded. Oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to work on that. I want to invite you to go one step further and actually block and tackle for your people. And what that means, what that means is you going to your boss and saying, all right, Mel's got 4 things on her plate. She can only do 3. Which one are we dropping? Which one are we going to deprioritize? And taking the hit that Mel feels, rather than having the person with less positional power having to bear the burden of this impossible workload. This also has to do with distributing work fairly. I don't know about you, but sometimes people who are very good at their job get rewarded / punished with more work, right? Because they're people you know can get it done. And so part of your job as a leader is not just distributing to those you know who can do and work themselves into the ground, but thinking about building capabilities and skills so that workload over time is distributed more fairly. And the last thing I'll share about health on the manager side of the house is, we all know that there are leaders on our team, maybe not in your organization now, maybe back in previous organizations, that cause bottlenecks. They don't respond to emails. They don't do what they need to do. I want to invite you, if you're a manager that values health in your team, you need to step up when other leaders are slowing down the train or causing undue burden on your team members. This shouldn't be something that someone with less power has to navigate. This is a way that you can help make their roles more sustainable. The last thing I'll share on this, and I know some questions have come in the chat as well, we will have Q&A time, is as an org leader, what's the difference between like a people manager and, let's say, you're a head of development? What are you doing? Well, you are looking for trends across your team in terms of who's turning over. You are managing your managers well to ensure good management is happening, particularly across lines of racial difference, gender difference, and other dimensions of difference. And you are creating the conditions so that it's easy to push back on you if your expectations are unfair or if you're slowing down the train. So those are the kinds of things that leaders are doing, team members are doing, managers are doing if they're trying to lead in a way that's healthy. All right, I'm going to move us to the next letter. So let's lead in a way that's equitable. And as leaders, or even those with some positional power in organizations, I'm looking at you, senior manager, senior director, those who've gotten a little bit of rank, we need to grapple with real issues of inequity, unfair and unjust practices that adversely impact members of our team. And regardless of role, if we observe something, and we should be looking, we should be seeking to observe, right? We need to use what power and access we do have to speak up. That doesn't mean that, there isn't real risk. It doesn't mean that it's comfortable, but we do use the power and access we do have. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're in a meeting, a cross-team collaboration meeting, and someone cuts off someone else, or dismisses their idea outright. Well, you can use the access and the power that you do have to double stamp the idea. I really like what Mel said there. Let's give it a second look. Or, hey, I know this wasn't our intent, but this is the third time we've spoken over someone else on our team. Can we be more careful around that? There are ways that you can use what you do have to get more equitable outcomes when you see patterns in how people are being treated. So what does it look like at the leadership level? It looks like implementing structure. It's kind of boring. Structures, best practice informed policies and processes, setting goals and have around equity, and having transparent report outs on how we're doing. Evaluating managers based on equitable outcomes and practices in their people management. So if you're a development leader, you should be evaluating your managers, not just on whether they're making it rain. Yes, let's do that. But also, do their teams like working for them though? Are people quitting on them? Because people don't leave you because the coffee's bad. They leave their managers. They may tell you it's grad school, they're lying. The reason they were looking most of the time is because their management is not what it needed to be. And so you should be evaluating those managers that report to you based on their outcomes, not just in terms of the numbers on the board, but in terms of the people they're managing. This also looks like investing in executives and in people managers so that they're developing these lenses and skills. I can't tell you how many clients that I work with right now that executives have been executiving, right, for 10 years. And just never had the time to develop some of these lenses and skills. And so at the organizational level, I'm looking at you exec team members, we should be prioritizing developing you so that you can lead managers to manage more effectively and equitably. You're like their ceiling. So if you're not good at this game, they're not going to be better than you, not until you improve. And then the last thing I'll share is we need to, as team members with positional power, develop muscles to notice when we're causing harm and fix things quicker, right? So in our sector this year, I don't know if you all have been watching it, there have been so many drags on social media. There's been so much public reckoning, right? As there should be. And I want to invite us to get better at noticing harm before there's been such a wake of people suffering that we now have a public correction. Not because I'm afraid of y'all being corrected publicly, do it. I don't have a problem with that. It's that we should be better than this. We care about the experience of social justice in the world. We need to be as serious about justice in our organizations as we are in these streets. And so developing the muscles to notice when we're causing harm and taking action to fix things immediately is not just going to save us public repercussions, but it's actually the work though. And so I want to invite us to that. I'm not going to go through this slide here because you'll get these slides, but these are 4 places where organizations typically suffer and don't live out their intentions on equity. And so you'll have this slide to look at later, but it's sort of helping you know where to start looking. And this is particularly for people managers and above. All right, I want to move us to lead in a way that's anti-racist. And a lot of us have heard this. We're talking, orgs are releasing anti-racist statements. We're Black Lives Matter, we're anti-racist, we're against anti-Blackness. And yet our handbooks ain't changed though. And we're still managing people to bulleted lists and spreadsheets. And I want to invite us to think about who has set management practices and organizational norms in our sector. And so whose preferences do we actually treat like they're requirements, like they're the only way to do the job? And in fundraising, you know this particularly because we're interfacing with philanthropy, there are some very specific preferences that actually are not requirements to do our jobs well and position some to succeed. And they set others on a track where they've got to overcome other people's preferences just to be at even. And so as people managers, as organizational leaders, as senior staff members, we should be interrogating our own norms and assumptions and confronting white normativity in our orgs. When there are preferences we have that actually don't mean the work is being done better, it just means we're more comfortable. Anti-racism looks like disrupting those preferences. And I'm going to give you a few. So this comes from Jones and Okun. These are some cultural characteristics that are often criticized as being emblematic of how white supremacy shows up in organizations. And real talk, I've been in the nonprofit sector for a while, so I know that this is where we live, right? So for example, right to comfort. We don't say the thing, we keep it real positive and nice and toxic positivity all the time, right? That's a practice that's inculcated based off of the sort of white normative preferences of our sector from its very beginning. How about this sense of urgency where everything is urgent all the time, all the time, all the time? And real talk, in many of our organizations, the stakes are high. I work in ed sector. So like kids learning, that's a big deal. There is urgency, but not everything is urgent. Not everything has a 24-hour service level on it. And if it does, I'm gonna invite you to check your preferences, because you might be setting up people with less power, and that tends to be in our sector, Black and Indigenous and people of color that are at the bottom of your org chart, at a disadvantage. And so I just want to invite you to think about how defensiveness, fear of open conflict, a focus on individual achievement, even if your rainmaker is throwing everybody on the ops team for a loop, right? Like how those actually might be setting up some people to win and some people to lose. And as a senior staff member with some level of access and influence, how can you help to disrupt some of these? What is one move you might make? I'm not asking you to burn the place down, please don't. What I'm inviting you to is to think about how you can use your influence and access, whether as a people manager, an individual contributor, or an organizational leader, to move us closer to a place where people can thrive and where our preferences are not so steeped in one way of working. All right, I'm seeing the chats coming. It's coming in hot, I see, okay. Yes. And I also want to name, there was one thing that somebody said about top down. What we're finding is in organizations that are actively disrupting a lot of these preferences, there is more shared power. That's real. Because this belief that people in the top chair know what they're doing is actually only one way to see the situation. Another way to see it is people who are in the top chair haven't done the work at the bottom in a long time. And so anti-racist management practices often include shared power, more participative decision-making, etc. All right, I'm gonna move us to the next letter, and I'm excited for the questions that are coming in as well. We need to lead in a way that's real. We need to create psychologically safe places where people can be real. That does not mean the level of realness you have with your BFF that you're hanging out with on the weekend. It means professional trust, professionally psychologically safe places where people can take risks, where they can make mistakes, and they feel like generally, not always, but generally, they'll be able to recover if they make a goof. And this is true of both staff and leaders. Now, impact is impact and there should be accountability, but there also needs to be room for growth, because when there's not, that same level of critical judgment swings back and hits people with least power in the organization. It doesn't just hit leaders, it doesn't just hit people managers, it swings back, and that boomerang will knock everybody out. And so what does that look like in practice? It means that in our sector, where we prioritize social justice, where we call in people who are causing harm, we fight disposability culture while creating the conditions for accountability. So when I cause a goof, call me in. If I'm having impact across lines of race or gender or power, call me in. And there has to also be a path for people to recover, let's say 60% of the time. Sometimes you do some stuff and there ain't no recovery, you gotta go. But a lot of times there's a growth edge that happens, and when people are restored to community, that community is stronger for it if we build the conditions for psychological safety and for restoration of trust and sort of restorative practices in organizations. It also means that we have to have shared working agreements about how we address harm, how we disagree in community, how we give sensitive feedback. A lot of organizations aren't teaching people how to do this, and so everybody's tearing each other up because we haven't talked about what do we do when a manager makes a goof and it causes harm. How do they fix that? Nobody's taught us. And so people are using their lizard brain and panicked and like, and making worse mistakes trying to address the harm that they've caused. We need to create conditions to disagree in community, to give sensitive feedback, or else we're going to just let people, sort of be on cruise control. And we all know how that goes and who suffers when that happens. The other thing that I want to invite us to around psychological safety and realness is creating the conditions for people to share more with each other as they learn to feel comfortable that it won't be weaponized against them. In a lot of organizations where I've served as a people operations leader, or I've been in other sort of HR leadership roles, there were values under the surface that looked like they were cultural clashes, but they weren't. They were values clashes. But we weren't curious enough about each other to understand what those clashes were and to come to a place of agreement or alignment around them. And so as we build realness, there can be more disclosure and more safety for us to get real about values and where they bump up against each other without putting undue burden on Black, Indigenous, people of color, others at the margins, to do all that educating. So I'm going to skip this slide. You'll have it in your deck, but I do want to name one thing before I go, which to go to the last piece, which is we need to stop it with the family metaphor. Orgs aren't families. And when I ask people I coach who are Black, Indigenous, people, and people of color, or others at the margins, the family metaphor means I can't speak up when you're causing harm. It means that I have to bear it. And it has a manipulative effect on people in the organizations with less power. So if there's one thing I want to invite you to, quit it with the family metaphor. We ain't a family, we're a team. And that gives people who don't want to have that level of like cultish, deep love for each other, it gives them space to set boundaries for themselves. And so I want to invite you to be thinking about who benefits from calling us a family and who does not benefit. All right, I'm on the last letter, y'all. Lead in a way that's trust-centered. We must do the work to be trustworthy and make what we expect of others explicit so they have a chance to win or recover our trust, especially across lines of difference. Back in the day in our sector, I was talking to a managing partner at Management Center about this the other day. People used to just trust leaders because they had that job. But we know, all of us know, that ain't true anymore. Leaders don't just get trust, they have to earn it. And if you're a leader in your organization, especially across lines of racial difference, gender difference, power difference, because of the trauma people have experienced in our sector, we've got to build muscles in winning and keeping and recovering trust if we want to keep our team together. So the last idea I'm going to share around this, so how do I win trust, Mel? What does that look like? Well, trust in my experience has only 4 things. It's trust in your competence. Can I trust you to do your job? Do you know what you're doing? Trust in your character. Are you going to do the right thing? Are you a snake in the grass? Trust in consideration, and leaders fall down on this all the time, especially across lines of difference. Can I trust you to have me in mind when you make decisions? And common focus. Can I trust you to advance our shared goals? If you don't have these 4 areas working for you in your leadership, especially across lines of difference, then there will be a trust gap. And that trust gap is amplified the more dimensions of difference are between us. And so when I'm telling you work on trust, work on building and keeping and recovering trust, these are the 4 areas that I'm inviting you to work. So I have just one more slide. What does it mean for an org to be trust-centered? Well, 3 things. 1, building trust and keeping trust and recovering trust is a competency expected and required of leaders. And by leaders, I mean senior staff members, I mean people managers, I mean senior leaders. All of us need to know how to build and keep and recover trust, especially across lines of difference. 2, we've got to do the work to recover trust when it's broken. And we've got to train our team on how to recover trust when they goof it up. And lastly, we have explicit standards with each other on what it takes to protect that trust over time. All right, so I wanna cede my last few seconds for questions because I know there are many, but that's the gist of it. Heart-centered leadership, healthy, equitable, anti-racist, real, and trust-centered leadership gets you better results with your team, especially across lines of racial difference, gender difference, power and tenure difference. And so that's my invitation to you. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so we can go to questions. All right. Patrick, should I just go into the questions box, or are you all gonna tell me what to do?
Great. That was so wonderful. I'm going to share my screen, do a couple of announcements, and then we're going to take all the rest of the time on questions because we have so many. So let me, but I rarely get to watch the actual chat as these things happen, and it's so nice to see how resonant this was for so many folks. So thank you so much, Melanie. Really just wonderful. A couple of quick announcements, and then I want to spend a bunch of time on questions because we have a lot of questions and a lot of really good ones. Just a quick reminder, if you get a chance to fill out this survey, which I think my colleague Simone is going to drop in now. We're going to give away this book, and I hope you read it. And I hope you read it if you don't get selected to get one as well. Second thing, a bunch of folks on our team over here put together a diversity stats template, which basically helps you track not only who's representing your organization, but who's been promoted, who's been fired, who decided to leave. And so you can really take a look at that and see all the data in one place. And a lot of hard work went in there. And so really easy. And just make a note in the survey if you want us to send you this as well. And then two last things. On this Thursday, my colleagues Alyssa and David, who are just wonderful, are going to give a quick demo of a bunch of planned giving and major giving tools, and then share some case studies about how other people are being successful with them and what they're doing. So if you're curious about what some of the cutting edge nonprofits are doing, we'll walk through that with Alyssa and David. They're excellent. And then lastly in the survey also, if you are looking for a demo of either a beneficiary tool, which is new and exciting, stocks or bequests or QCDs, just a lot of different stuff around how do you make the most powerful giving types super easy and much more accessible to a lot of people. Historically, they've been the domain of just a few folks, and we've been really lucky to help democratize some of that. So that is exciting. We're going to take a 30-second break right now. If you don't mind, we'll drop the survey link in the chat now, and I'm going to just go through some of the questions, and I'll prioritize them because we're not going to get to all of them, and then we'll ask Melanie to rejoin us, and we'll go through a bunch of those. So take 60 seconds if you don't mind. Fill out the survey that's in the chat, and I'm going to start sorting through all these questions because it seems like we have some really wonderful ones. So good. Okay, let's get rolling. Melanie, I'll invite you back on video because I think there's one question for me, and then all the questions are for you. So first question is for me. I'll answer this one. This is from Anne. It says, thanks so much for sharing the data. Who were the respondents? Were they at all levels or primarily leadership upper management? Because we see disparity. And this was all levels. So it goes to all the folks who were invited to the session. It's a really good point. Maybe in the future, we'll sort of break it out whether folks are managers or not and see if there's any difference there. So thank you for that. Melanie, a lot of these questions are anonymous, so occasionally we'll pop in names, but some folks wanted to maintain anonymity. First thing is, when we talk about prioritizing sustainability for ourselves, and it's tough, right? Because the mission is so important that it feels like, at a different place you might be doing it for your boss, but here you're sort of doing it for your boss and the mission. Do you have any particular tips on what it looks like, especially as a more junior staff person, to prioritize sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing, and this is particularly true in our sector for cis women, so people who were identified as girls at birth and still claim to be women, and that's the gender that they hold. So oftentimes when we have bandwidth concerns, it becomes an emotional thing, like, oh, I wish I could, but I can't. Coaching across lines of gender, that just is not as true for cis men. So typically, as one example, I was coaching a younger cis man who was having a boundary issue and was in an operations shop. And he said, all right, so I've got 5 priorities and I can only get 3 done well. Which 2 are we dropping? And literally all his colleagues, when they heard him say that identified as cis women, clutched pearls, like, oh, like, you got away with that, right? And so I want to invite you, how could we make it more matter of fact when we are at bandwidth capacity? So some things I've really said, okay, so we've got a dinner table full of stuff and I've got a dinner plate worth of capacity. So we can either decide what's going to be compromised or we can be surprised. I'd rather decide up front. The one risk is if you say you can't do something and then you burn the midnight oil and you proceed to do it, I, as your manager, no longer believe you. And so I want to invite you, and particularly for women of color on the line, this happens with us all the time. Like, we'll say, oh, it's impossible, I can't do it, my team can't do it. And then we'll make magic happen. And then I, as your manager, know, oh, she's just going to complain, but she's going to get it done anyway. So set the boundary and keep the boundary is my main advice, and do it in a matter-of-fact way when you can.
Yeah, great point. This is an interesting question. If you're part of an organization which historically, including mission-wise, is focused on a very specific community of color, is there an obligation to always speak out about all communities and races, or are there times when we can just focus on one community?
Yeah, so I think that what we learn is that there is intersectionality and there are ways in which injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? Like Dr. King said. And we also have our own swim lanes, and in our sector, areas of deep expertise. In my own experience, it is impossible for me to believe that I can do work on anti-Blackness or racial justice and not even be conversant in the experiences of others that are at the margins as well. That doesn't mean that I have equal knowledge. For example, I'm currently building my knowledge on the experiences of Indigenous folks in this country and the experience and the history of erasure there. So I'm not going to say my pool is as deep in terms of the knowledge that I have, but as someone who's about this work, I'm about dismantling and being anti-racist and dismantling white supremacy everywhere it shows up. And there may be areas of specialization, but that doesn't mean that I don't do my work in other areas too.
Yeah, great question. A couple of good questions about this idea of calling in, which I think people found appealing and yet uncertain about how to exactly do it. Do you have any best practices on language or word choice when you address something? And specifically, there are some questions around how do you disarm defensiveness?
Yep. So the first thing I want to name is that it isn't your job to disarm defensiveness, particularly if you have less power in the organization, if you're showing up and you're a person at the margins. And we're humans. And so when we're in panic mode, we're not going to hear you as well as we could hear you, yeah? And so the way that I think about calling out, and Dr. Loretta Ross has amazing work on this, is that the purpose of a call out is not punishment, it's to restore community. So you did something that broke community. I'm going to show you what you did, and I'm going to invite you to a different process to restore us to community and repair harm. If that's your intention, that's going to land really differently than a clapback. And there's some times where, honestly, I'm petty today, and it's going to be a clapback. And I want to invite you to do that with both eyes open, because there is a cost, right? And so when you come in with that sort of a punitive approach, understanding that leaders need to be called in and there's more accountability, but sometimes it'll break trust in such a way that it's hard to restore community afterward. And yet, if there's a pattern of abuse, sometimes a call out is what's needed.
Great. This is, I'm going to paraphrase this. There's a long question here about private foundations, so I'm going to shorten it if I can. Someone writes that they've seen the list of white supremacist norms and values, and we've had good discussions about this at our small nonprofit, which is about 18 people. But also, a lot of the private foundations that support us, and a lot of the big funders have not had these conversations. As development director, I feel like part of my job is to run interference between the funders and our people. But I don't want colleagues to perceive that we have a double standard when money is concerned. Any suggestions to speak to that challenge?
Could you reframe? I missed the part of the question. Could you say it one more time?
Basically, the challenge is that there's lots of these great discussions about breaking down sort of white supremacy norms and other things within the organization. And yet their funders, who we're looking for grants or other things from, have not had these conversations. And so we have a development director who's sort of trying to figure out whether she can protect her staff from all these stuff, or do we have a double standard when it comes to money, and how might you address that? Because there's certainly, enormous power differential, not just between leadership and and junior staff, but between funders and leadership.
Yep. So orgs are all grappling with this issue. Philanthropy is behind us. You're 100% right. And I want to tell you the orgs that I would follow, the orgs where I would continue to work, the orgs where the highest performing people in fundraising stick around, particularly Black and Indigenous and people of color on your team and others at the margins, are organizations that have the contracting conversation with their funders up front. What that means is this is the work that we're into. This is what we believe about that work. These are our boundaries around that work. Orgs that don't stand for anything fall for anything, right? And so they'll continually have that sort of abuse enacted on their more junior staff, which tend to be their Black and Indigenous and people of color and others at the margins. So if you're a development leader, thinking about how we build relationships with funders where calling in is possible, and that may be a program officer that you've built relationship with over years, or thinking about what are the boundaries where we protect certain staff from those relationships. And so I, as a non-Black person of color, may take a gig that someone else would have taken because I'm not going to have them interfacing with someone who can cause harm. I've seen orgs take both stances.
Yeah, that's really smart. I also would just add that you can let people surprise you. Right? These folks who are grant makers and other things, maybe they've done things a certain way for 20, 30 years, but if they're really mission aligned, don't necessarily presuppose that they're going to react very poorly to some of these requests. This is a good one. How do you handle orgs where leadership feel that they're leading with heart, but the workers might feel differently?
Right, and that's always the case, right? Because we tend to think the best of our own performance, right? So the metaphor I've been using with leaders that has really worked, so steal it, take it please, is that leading in a heart-capable way is a lot like being a chef, okay? And so who decides if a chef is good? Is it their certification on the wall? No. It's the people eating the food. And so we've got to find a way to hear from the people eating the food, and their opinion has to supersede our own opinion of our abilities, right? And so if your food's salty, it's salty, right? We've got to deal with it, but the frame has to be changed from, I am a leader, so therefore I know. I studied at this cooking school, so therefore I know. And instead, what is the experience of people eating your soup though? Are they spitting it out? Are they going to a different restaurant? If so, then we've got change to do. So I would steal that metaphor and use it in context of sharing employee survey data, exit interview data with leaders that need to change.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's do 2 more questions. So the first one, there's a lot of variant questions on this, really responding well to the idea that the family metaphor is not quite apt. One question is says the family point really resonated with me. I work for a very small organization. We often say family. Any recommendations on how to shift this language, especially if you are an individual contributor who might presumably be a little bit more junior?
Yeah, I mean, what I've done when I haven't had the formal power is start using the word team. And the reason I like the word team is team has clear division of labor. You can be on a team and be an elite performer. You aren't just grabbing trays, right? You can be talented and gifted in your role. And your manager then is more of a coach who can see things, but probably can't dunk baskets as good as you, right? And so I really like the team metaphor. So I've just dropped it. And when people are like, oh, we're such a, I love being part of this family, reframing. Yeah, this team means a lot to me too. I particularly love how people can shine in their superpowers. We're the Avengers, y'all, or whatever it is, and just actually start socializing the language. I will say, if you're a leader on this line, when I've shared this in mixed community across lines of race, I will often get a private Zoom chat like, thank goodness. Thank goodness. And it's typically from Black and Indigenous and people of color or others who are underrepresented in the organization or in positions of less power. Like, I can breathe out. Because unfortunately, in the family metaphor, you now have to educate everyone on everything. Right? You don't get to set boundaries for your bandwidth, for your personal needs, for not wanting to hang and go to drinks together. You can't do that in a family, but you for sure can do that on a team.
That's great. All right, so our last question is from Tracy. It sort of echoes a lot of the positive things. And she just wants to know, how do we invite Melanie to speak at our organization? Can I pass the website for her to my leadership? What's the best way to, there's a question in the survey, by the way, about whether you want to get more resources and get the HEART framework from Melanie. So make sure to sort of check that box if you can. any other tips in terms of getting in touch with you or making the
Yeah.
most of it at our organizations?
Thank you so much. I put my email in the chat, y'all. I'm just Melanie at Breaker28. Also, if you click that button on the survey, they will connect you to me. I do have a heart assessment that I'd be glad to give you for free, so you can do a little bit of a like check yourself situation on how heart capable you are as a leader. And so feel free to take advantage of that, and I'll make it happen for you.
Great. All right. Well, so let's close out there. First, just a huge thank you to Mel for joining.
Yeah.
It's been so wonderful to sort of see the response. And it echoes a lot of, I think, how our team felt when we were able to get some good training from Mel. So thank you so much for doing this. And hopefully we can do more training together soon as well. And then just a huge thank you to everybody who joined for an hour today. I know that there's so much going on in your life. Personally, forget about work and stuff. So much happening in your existence with your family, with your kids, with your parents, siblings, and everything else, and then so much happening professionally as we're sort of navigating this sort of wild year and wild 12 months. 12 months into quarantine, beginning to turn the corner. So just a huge sense of gratitude, and I know that some of this stuff can be super important and still hard to engage on, and so having the courage to show up here and listen was really, really powerful. So thank you. And then if you're free, we'd love to see you in 2 weeks on April 6th. And we're going to do a big session on what fundraising looks like in a post-vaccine world and what you might expect for the rest of 2021, which will be pretty different than the second half of 2020. End of year giving will shift and so much. So I'm really excited about that. We're doing a ton of research and looking at what best practices are from across the sphere for that. So again, big thank you to you all for joining, and a big thank you to Mel. But this was a really great hour, and it was nice to spend it with you. So see you very soon, and thanks again.